Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LEC Playoffs Round Number 1 overview and analysis video here in the winter split. Man, am I excited to get into this. The regular season is over. Our first two teams have been eliminated from the first split of the year here, those of course being Rogue in 9th place and Carmine Corp in 10th place. Definitely not, I think, what either of those organizations wanted to happen, but we have our top 8, and that means we get to move on into the playoff stage, or I guess more accurately, the group stage. Technically, it's all one big playoffs now, but it's the exact same format as it was last year, just kind of condensed into one bracket. So if you hear me call it the group stage throughout this video, that's essentially what it is. But today, we're going to be going over the first 6 series that we got in the playoffs. Round 1, a bit of round 2, as we obviously know. We've got our first 2 teams that are qualifying for the top 4, essentially, for the actual playoff stage, the best of 5 stage here in the winter split. So I'm very excited to go over, but if you guys are as well, let me know down in the comments section below. Did things go as you expected? Were there any upsets? You know, for me, I think we'll get into it, but not really that crazy of a playoff weekend. Pretty much everything went according to plan. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It means that the teams that showed good things in the regular season continue to show good things here, which is very good. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we talk about. At the end of the week, there will be no player of the week, there will be no dud of the week, there will be no power rankings, because we're at the stage where teams are getting, kind of eliminated, where it's really only relevant who you are playing next and not so much what your true form is looking like. So instead, I'll be giving a quick overview of, what the bracket looks like and give my predictions on who I think will be making it into the top 4 and, where I think things might go from there instead of my normal kind of standings, power rankings, etc. kind of thing. But that means we can jump right into the analysis. I am going to be going a bit different. Usually I would just go chronologically in terms of these games, but just like last year, they are kind of separated into 2 sides of the bracket. The brackets never overlap until you get to the top 4. And so I'm actually going to be separating it by talking about each side of the bracket first. And I will be doing that in the order that they played their games, which means that we're going to talk about the bottom side of the bracket, or Group B, or whatever you want to say, first here, and that means we get to talk about the first round on that Group B side, the bottom side of the bracket. I hope this just makes more sense. I think it's going to be easier to follow to talk about the 4 teams on one side, finish all of the conversations about the 3 series they have, and then move on to the 3 series on the top side. I think it'll just keep things a little bit cleaner in terms of explaining, where these teams exactly are. So starting with the bottom side of the bracket, we had our top seed taking on the bottom seed of that side. It was the number 2 seed in BDS taking on the number 7 seed in Team Heretics. And BDS was able to pick up the 2-0 win. Relatively clean, not a super difficult series for them to win. Some pretty big problems for Heretics right now. They fall down into the losers bracket. BDS moves on into, I guess, the winners finals of this group. And I think we all kind of saw this coming. Even if there are a lot of people, me included, that think that Heretics are a little bit better than their record, 4-5 probably isn't indicative of how good this team is, and I expect them to look better in best of 3s. BDS is one of the best teams in the league. One of the few teams that I would say is pretty clearly better than Heretics at the current moment, and they certainly showed it off in this series. This team is just a very complete unit as 5. Basically, everybody is playing at a top level right now. Even the players that weren't stunning in the regular season, I think, had a great series here, but Heretics' problems are very obvious. It's very easy to point them out. Now, I do think that some of it is a little scapegoaty, which I'll get into, but some of it very much isn't. There are problems here that are very easily exposed. So let's talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Ice in the bot lane. This is the first one I've given him on BDS here. I really do think this was probably his most influential series as a player. Typically speaking, it's LeBrav on these big playmakers, these hook champions like the Blitzcrank, like the Nautilus, going out and making plays, being super aggro, being very proactive, and creating advantages for Nuke in the mid lane in particular, but playing with Sheo and Adam dominates team fights. Ice kind of just fills his role, doesn't necessarily have to be a primary carry for the team. His score lines often look really good, but he's really not asked to do a whole ton on this team. I think this series was probably his most impressive as a member of BDS. His ability to position on the Varus, I think, was really good. Flathead actually had a very good series, and I think Kaiser played well in that same vein, but Ice just outplayed both of them, and I think that's a very good sign. I was concerned with whether or not his mechanics would be able to hold up in the LEC. He feels like a pretty good addition. He's not a superstar in the bot lane. I don't know if there are any superstars in the bot lane right now in the LEC, but Ice is near the top of the list purely from the consistency, and, you know, he showed here that he does have the ability to take over games if you give him the resources to do so. But I want to give a big shout out to Nuke in the mid lane. Pretty big mid gap this series, which we'll talk about on the other side, but a lot of that was Nuke's great positioning in lane and very strong lane prowess on the Orianna. These laning phases aren't exactly the easiest, especially game 2 with the Nico. Not always the easiest to just like win on Orianna in that matchup, but I think Nuke has just really turned himself into a very competent, you know, upper half mid laner at the LEC level. I still don't know if he's a superstar. Like, is he Caps? Is he humanoid? I don't think so, but Nuke is still very, very good, and he showed that again here. If you give him a matchup that he can win, he's going to win it. He's very consistent, and I think Sheo was playing some of the best League that he's played all year. He was kind of the weak point of this BDS team. The reason you might have been concerned about them going into the playoffs was he really didn't have a great regular season, but he was amazing in this series, went deathless on Xin Zhao and Poppy. That is a very good sign. He was just everywhere on the map, creating a lot of advantages. You can give a lot of credit to both Nuke and Labrov for creating for Sheo, but he still did a great job following up. Adam was great, was able to get the Garrett in game 2. Generally, it was just all 5 of BDS that looked really good in this series, and I think that's the biggest positive you could possibly give them. And then for Heretics, this team has a very glaring issue in the mid lane, and Perks is going to get dead of the series, but I do want to point out, you know, I will tear into Perks in just a second. He did not play well in this series, but I also do think that he is a very, like, front-facing problem of this team. I think because he has struggled recently and because there has always been a narrative kind of surrounding Perks that, you know, oh, he's this player that throws games for his team, he's washed or whatever, that his flaws, I think, are highlighted more than the other flaws of players on this team. I think Yankos was arguably just as bad in this series as Perks was, but nobody's talking about Yankos because he's a player that is generally more accepted by the community, and yes, he's been more consistent, but, you know, I think they were probably equally as bad in this series. Yankos had no pressure on the map, played the Maokai miserably in game number 1, basically just gave up everything and allowed the Orianna to run over the game. The vibe was a little bit more proactive in game 2, but kind of had to be. You're playing Kalista, Blitzcrank, Nico. Like, if you're not moving on the Vi in the early game, what are you doing? Still wasn't very active and still wasn't very good in that game. I get it that Perks was bad and he is going to get dead of the series. Trust me, he didn't play good or well in this series, I should say, but you know, I don't think he is the only problem with Heretics like Reddit would make you believe. He is a problem, and he has been one of the worst players in the league, specifically for the past, like, 2-ish weeks. He has really, really been bad. One of the worst players in the LEC at the current moment, but if he was as bad as he was in this series, and everybody else on this team played really well, Heretics would have won a game. Like, that is just kind of the truth. You had an opportunity to be able to do stuff, and the rest of the team did kind of let them down. I still think Flacket and Kaiser were the best part of this team. Kaiser is unironically the best player on Heretics, and it's not particularly close right now. I don't know if you're going to hear that opinion a lot from other people. A lot of people are going to say Yankos, because, again, they like Yankos. I like Yankos. I like him as a personality, but Kaiser has pretty clearly been this team's ace over the course of the season. He continues to look good on playmakers to set up for Flacket, but it's just not enough. Jungle mid got run over in this series. Wunder had no pressure on the top side, and honestly, he's been a little bit disappointing over the course of this split. Really has not done a whole ton in terms of 1v1 top lane matchups. It's just quietly lost in a lot of different ones, basically no matter what he's playing. I know the matchups aren't ideal in this series, but still, you would hope that Heretics could be able to do more, but right now, it just feels like their main players are letting them down. This feels like a team that, while I kept them in the top 4 of my power rankings, that might have been too rich. This does not feel like a top 4 team in the league right now. There still is a chance for them to get out of this group. The second team in this group, in Group B, as you'll see as we go further along, is super wide open. There really aren't a lot of star teams outside of BDS in this group. If Heretics can get some momentum back, there is still a shot for them to get into that top 4 spot. But right now, it just doesn't feel like that's super likely with the losing streak that they're on. And for BDS, this is one of the best teams in the league. Yes, they kind of fumbled down the stretch with that K-Corp loss, but, you know, that was them not trying. I mean, this is still a dominant team, and I'm excited to see what they can do. They are absolutely favorites to get out of this group as the number 1 seed, and I don't think this series would change anybody's mind on that. Then moving on to our second series, and like I said, it's not going to be the one from day number 1. We're going to stay on the side of the bracket that we were on first, and then we will go back around and talk about all of the action there. It was split up into, you know, one series from each day, or from each side on each day. So we're going to be moving to the day 2 series here from this side of the bracket, and that was the number 3 seeded SK Gaming taking on the number 6 seeded Team Vitality. And Vitality is going to be able to pick up the win here. Now, this looks like an upset, and honestly, it is kind of an upset. I had Vitality lower in my power rankings, and obviously they were the 6th seed. SK was the 3 seed. This is one that, theoretically is considered an upset, but I don't think a lot of people were surprised by this, me included. Vitality honestly matches up really well into a team like SK Gaming because what they like to generate leads through, SK that is early aggression. And man, is Vitality willing to be aggressive. They're willing to match that aggression. Irrelevant likes to get his leads on the top side isolated in the 1v1. Photon's really good at denying that, even though he wasn't really all that good at denying that in this series, and you're really relying on young players like Isma and Exakick and DOS to be able to step up and compete against this really fast-paced team, and I don't think they drafted particularly well, and all of a sudden now we are sitting here with a Vitality 2-0 win. Really good stuff from them. This team is legit. I was very concerned after week number 1 where they went 0-3, but they've honestly been a top 5 team ever since then. They've been very, very fun to watch, maybe even a top 4 team ever since then. They've been really, really fun to watch in that sense, and one of the players that has been probably the most fun to watch in the entirety of the LEC kind of get their groove back has been VTO in the mid lane, who is going to get my player of the series here. This is the VTO that I remember, the Yone transitioning right into Lee Sin mid against Lucian. This is a really fun matchup that VTO dominated on. Really fun stuff to watch him just go out on a champion like Lee Sin and just play super aggro, be willing to fight, be willing to trade, be willing to just kind of make plays early on in these games. He ends up 1v3ing down the stretch. VTO was a player who felt, he's kind of the exact curve of that meme, it is so doomed versus we are so back. He is the exact, representation of that in the LEC where, he breaks out as this MVP caliber player on Misfits early on in his career. He leaves Misfits and goes to Excel, and last year is a disaster. Really not good at any point on Excel, goes to Heretics and is fine, generically fine, mostly on the champions that he is, comfortable on, like the Kai'Sa, weird things like that, but really wasn't, a star mid laner or anything, and he goes to Vitality here for what I assume is very cheap money, essentially gets traded for perks, and he has been amazing back here on Vitality. He's been given the keys to the kingdom again. He's gotten his confidence back, and I think it looks really good for him at the current moment. Genuinely one of the more interesting players in the LEC, and somebody that's good enough to be the best player on a team that makes top 4 at the current moment. I thought Douglas played really well in this series. Shout out to the double brand game. He is clearly a brand guy. He has been playing it a ton in solo queue if you track his solo queue account. And he also picked up a ton of wins on it at the end of the split. And so at this point, just ban it. I think brand is something that has become a pretty high priority ban against Vitality. Douglas looked way too good in this series, significantly better than he has looked throughout a majority of the season. Again, really nice to see it, but I would want to see what he looks like off of that champion first. Carzzy and Hilly were really good. Hilly is just a maniac on Leona. We already knew that, but it's always worth pointing out that no trend was bucked in this series. Hilly continuously went in over and over again, and maybe he died a few too many times on that champion, but still it was kind of worth it. And Carzzy was pretty good here. Definitely the better of the 280 carries. I think people forget how bad he was at the beginning of the split, but it's nice to see that he has kind of regained some of that composure that he had towards the end of the year on Mad Lions. Last year, Photon was whatever on the top side. Irrelevant was probably better, but who cares? He played Cassante. He was super relevant in team fights. So shout out to Vitality. This is a good win, and this is a bad loss for SK. I think you really wanted to kind of prove that you were a top team here, that 3-0 start in week number 1 was legit, but it just doesn't feel like it. This team has kind of fallen back to basically exactly where they were last year, which I think is where a lot of people expected them to be. Maybe a top 6 team, somewhere around there, like them and Mad Lions kind of fighting it out for a top 6 spot, but it's hard to really know right now. Unfortunately, the big concern in this series was how bad the bot lane was. Exakick is going to get my dud of the series. The gap was pretty big. His damage was incredibly lackluster. He just wasn't good enough, and this is the player that you really needed to see step up in order to solidify that SK was going to be a big breakout team this year. As much as I like the other players on this team, I like Isma, I like Niski, I like DOS, I even like Irrelevant, even though I push back on him a lot. I still like Irrelevant a lot. I was pushing for him for a long, long time. Exakick was the one that really needed to become a superstar for this team to really make headwaves and be, this 3-seed, a team that can make top 4. It just really hasn't happened this split. Hopefully, this doesn't deter him too much. Hopefully, this is more of an outlier than it is the continuation, but I'm starting to get a little bit worried that Exakick is just going to kind of settle into the same space that a lot of other LEC 80 carries have, which is just good but not great, inconsistently good, which is frustrating. Also, people were very frustrated that this team played for Niski in this series on the Hui and on the Lucian. I don't know why. Niski's been this team's best player for a majority of this season. Isma obviously helped out a lot. People are like, oh, you should play for Irrelevant on the top side. First off, obviously, everybody knows I'm a bit lower on Irrelevant. Not really that much lower, but a bit lower. He's top 4. Top 3-ish for me. I don't know if I'm willing to call him top 1 like everybody else is right now because there are a lot of good top laners in the LEC, but Irrelevant is very good. I'm not going to deny that, but it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what he is good at. a lot of people see Irrelevant winning and immediately say, oh, give him resources, when oftentimes Irrelevant is at his best when he gets to isolate in the top lane, when he gets these 1v1s and very good matchups in draft like he was able to get in this series, specifically in Game 2 on the Akali, when he's just able to go into a good matchup and win it on the top side, translate that into teamfight success. That's what Irrelevant is really good at, because he's very good at laning, he's very good at dominating pressure, and he's very good at team fighting. And so I actually don't like the idea of sending more attention and more resources up his way, because that forces the enemy team to then, kind of do the same, and then all of a sudden you're stuck in this 2v2 where Irrelevant can't be as aggressive without his jungler there, and it's just not really a situation that I think is beneficial for him. Again, nothing against Irrelevant, I just see a lot of people being like, why were you not sending resources to Irrelevant in the top lane? He's easily the best player on this team. Again, I think it's more so just an understanding of what he is good at and what you want to play for when it comes to Irrelevant to get the most out of him. He was pretty good in this series, probably the team's best player. Niski was good for a little bit of the series, was able to pick up some gold and some kills, but at the end of the day, was not nearly enough to be able to carry games. SK just felt a little bit outmatched here, and I think generally that's kind of the vibe right now, is that SK is a good, not great team, and Vitality is really trending upwards at the current moment. Obviously, we're going to talk about the third and final series coming up, the two winners facing off against each other, but Vitality's one win away from getting into top 4. Hylissang has never not been to the finals when he joins a new team in their first split. Not saying that the trend is absolutely going to continue here, but it's certainly something to monitor. Vitality is peaking at the right time, and this was a really nice win for them. And then moving on to our Group B finals here, we are going to find out the team between the two winners that we just talked about that will be moving on officially into the top 4, the best of 5 stage. It was, of course, Team BDS taking on Team Vitality. And BDS is going to pick up the big win here. They are going to be the team moving on. They're going to be winning their group, and none of this was unexpected. We all kind of knew that this was going to happen. The other 3 teams in this group are all very interesting to talk about. Heretics, Vitality, SK, all of them theoretically could get out of this group if things go right for them, but BDS was always the favorite to be the best team on this side of the bracket, and they absolutely were. They didn't drop a single game, 4-0 in the group stage, and they will be our first team to officially qualify for the top 4. Very good stuff from them. For Vitality on the other side, obviously, this sucks. They didn't play particularly well in this series, but still, you're not out yet. You still actually have a pretty good shot. You play the winner of the 2 losers when they play off against each other next weekend. Very excited to cover that, but for now, let's talk about this series. For BDS, player of the series is, of course, going to go to Adam. That Darius in Game 2, man, he really just is able to take over when he gets his Gods champions. Obviously, he can win on other things, too. His Cassante has been brilliant over the course of this split. I think some people might argue that it's been his best champion, specifically here in Winter. I don't know if I'm going to make that argument. Garen and Darius have both been really big picks for him, but Cassante is right up there with them, and I think that just shows that Adam is basically unbannable. At this point, either you ban all of his Gods champions and he just picks Cassante and, plays really well in team fights, or alternatively, you pick something else and you can't ban out all of his Gods champions and he gets one of the ones that he likes the most and he beats you on that too. Like, Adam feels basically uncounterable in the current meta with just how many champions he's super good at. 5 or 6 is just too many. And Adam is really, really good. In my opinion, right now, he is the best top laner in Europe, the best top laner in the LEC. He, spoiler alert, will almost certainly come in at number 1 in my top lane rankings when we go into spring. I'm very excited to be able to say that, but I was really interested to see if he was going to be able to follow up a great 2023 with a great 2024. So far, the answer to that has absolutely been yes. Photon is not a pushover by any means. He was, in the running for my number 1 top laner at the beginning of this year, but Adam just outplayed him in this series, and it was really, really good to see. Big credit to everybody else. Nuke was phenomenal once again. He really has been very good for this BDS team, genuinely a top 3-ish mid laner in the LEC. Not only this split, but last year as well. I think you can make an argument that this has been his best split, like individually in terms of performances, but it has been kind of on that progression curve that he showed over the course of 2023, so you're just happy to see it. Sheo continues to look amazing on these engagers to follow up on a lot of the big plays that, Nuke is making with engages on the Azir, or Labrav is making on big, hooks on Nautilus or Blitzcrank. He just is he seems to be settling into his role a bit better than he was in the regular season. Again, that really helps the team. Ice was great. Labrav was really solid. Overall, BDS is just a very complete team. Maybe they don't have one mega superstar, although I would argue that Adam is that guy on this team. They are great one-to to 5. Like, it doesn't matter. They don't have a weak link, and I think that that is a major problem for other LEC teams that are pretty used to taking advantage of a lane that they see as not as strong at the current moment. So good for BDS. They officially qualify for that best of 5, top 4 stage. And then for Vitality, again, they're not out. They actually go into losers finals with this loss, and you're not freaking out about that, but this was kind of a demolition. They were not particularly good in this series. Dead of the series very obviously is going to go to Hylissang in the support position. Sometimes Hilly dominates games and really, wins you a lot of pressure and prio in your lanes, as we saw in that series against SK. And sometimes he just runs it down on Ashe in game number 2 and insta-dies in every single fight, gets in melee range of a Darius, and just isn't useful at all. That's kind of what we saw in game number 2 of this series. So, not great from Hilly, but you have to take the good with the bad. That's always going to be what Hilly is about. Carzzy, I thought, was also pretty bad here. The positioning on him could have been significantly better, although he was the one player that I think was trying to stay out of harm's way when it came to Darius and Xin Zhao and Nautilus. He just couldn't effectively do that. He had no peel, and also he just had no damage. He wasn't particularly useful. Douglas got out-jungled entirely by Sheo in terms of the pressure he was able to offer. No brand, no wins for Vitality. Certainly something to monitor. The one player that I do think played relatively well was VTO. 2 games of Akali, what I think a lot of people would consider to be his signature champion. He looked good on it. He was solid. I wouldn't say he dominated, but, he was able to pick up some kills in these team fights, was able to trade some damage, but at the end of the day, if Akali is your only strong member of the team, you're just not going to be able to win that game. She's not enough to be able to 1v5. Photon on the Karma certainly did not work out in game number 1. He was fine on the Cassante in game 2, but overall Vitality, like I said, just kind of felt outmatched. It kind of feels like exactly what they just did to SK Gaming in the series that we just talked about previous. BDS is absolutely the better team, and even with VTO playing well, the volatility of the players that Vitality has brought in, especially Douglas, Carzzy, and Hylissang, definitely reared its head in this series. They still have a chance, a shot. They might even be favorites to get out of this group as the number 2 seed, but for now, it's going to be BDS moving on to that winner's finals, if you will, already in the playoff stage. Remember, the way that the playoff stage works, it's only top 4, and so BDS will play the winner of the other group in a best of 5. That winner immediately goes on to the LEC finals, which is big. BDS is already officially 1 series away from their second LEC finals. It would be very big for this organization. I know they definitely want to be there, and honestly, with how they're playing right now, you certainly can't count them out. I don't think people would be considering them favorites at the current moment, but I mean, they're really not all that far off, and this was not a difficult group stage for them. And now we get to move on to our second side of the bracket, technically the top side of the bracket, or Group A, or whatever you would want to call it again. It's the group stage, but it's not the group stage, so let's move back to day number 1, go back in time, and talk about what we started off with on the top side, and that was a matchup between the number 1 seeded G2 Esports and the number 8 seeded GIANTX. And of course, G2 really made very quick work of them. This was a demolition of a series. It never once looked even remotely close, and I think we all kind of expected it to turn out like this. I don't think a lot of people were expecting GX to actually put up a ton of fight against G2, but even so, really not a great performance from GX. They're going to move down into the lower part of the bracket, but G2 moves on. I think a lot of people are kind of, caught in the middle of where they feel about G2. I still see them as the number 1 team in the LEC. I think Caps and Yike have been playing out of their minds, and that certainly did not change in this series. I think if Broken Blade, Hans, and Mickey can all kind of get on board and start playing a little bit better, Hans has started playing a little bit better, I think that's really going to make this team close to unbeatable at the LEC level, because they are just a bit more talented than everybody else. Yike and Caps are probably the 2 best players in the entire region, and they get to play together, at least at the current moment. So, it's pretty good. And again, they dominated this series. Caps is going to get my player of the series, but you could very realistically give this to Yike as well. Both of them were terrific, and both of them gapped their opponents in a pretty incredible way. Caps is going to get it because he played Hui on stage and forced a ban out of GX because of the sheer amount of domination that he showed in that game number 1. If you're banning Hui purely because the enemy just obliterated you on it, not because you think it's all that strong, because it's really not all that strong, that's a problem. That is a major issue. Of course, the Azir in game 2 was still really good, but I think Yike was honestly the star of game 2 on the Vi. A lot of really good early pressure, some great engages, just great tempo. It's something that he really excels at as a jungler, is tempo and being able to create opportunities for his team to fight in advantage situations. Not a lot of other junglers do that at a super high level in the LEC, but It's really what makes Yike stand out to me. I think it's pretty clear that he is the best jungler in the LEC at this point. I love Elyoya, but I think Yike has taken over that #1 spot in my brain. Hans is playing a lot better. They've started putting him on things like Senna, and ironically enough, it's actually really started working for him. Teamfighting was always the weakest stage of his, game. He was always a much better laner than he was a team fighter, but Senna has actually been really proactive for G2, and he's looked a lot better in the last week or so than he did in the first 2 weeks, and then Mickey seems to be getting a little bit better on the Maokai. Broken Blade dominated this time on Yasuo and Zac and all these weird picks. Obviously, the Zac was a bit of a problem for GX. We saw that in the LCK, how Zac was able to really dominate in the right matchups, but generally, G2 just outskilled them. It really didn't matter what they ended up going for. In a draft like this, they are the better team, and they proved that they were the better team. Caps and Yike continue to look amazing, and it's nice to see Hans kind of stepping up as that third player here on G2 down the stretch. He really was not through the beginning parts. But for GX on the other side, this team just wasn't good enough. There really isn't a lot of analysis to do. You could give dead of the series to basically anybody. Odo went 1-7-2 in this series. Peach had 12 deaths on 2 games of Xin Zhao. That's really bad. Jackie's got mega gapped in the mid lane. Patrick kept dying on Ezreal and dealing no damage in team fights, but I'm going to give it to Ignar on the Yuumi because it's very rare that Yuumi consistently gets caught out in games because of just how safe Yuumi is generally, and Ignar did not do well. This was clearly a bit of a revenge series for G2. They were looking for him after the energy upset last year at Worlds, and Ignar unfortunately was the one to kind of pay the price in this series. If you're going to play 2 games of Yuumi, you better actually have pressure and prio, especially against Senna Maokai, and absolutely none was acquired. Patrick was useless, and a lot of that was Ignar not playing particularly well, but like I said, Peach died 12 times and gave up pressure instantly to Yike, especially in game number 2. Jackie's got mega gapped in the mid lane, especially in game number 1 on the Ahri. And I don't think Odo did anything this series other than die. It's not like anybody played well for GX. They all lost, they all got destroyed, but again, we kind of saw this coming. I mean, really, this isn't that big of a surprise. GX is not as good as G2, and honestly, they are by far the weakest of the playoff teams. We knew that going in. It was more of a bottom 3 than it was a bottom 2, and GX just happened to be the best of the bad teams, and they snuck their way in. I still don't think this changes my opinion at all about either of these teams. G2 is really good, GX is really bad. Obviously, G2 is going to have a much more difficult challenge later on in the week, no matter who they face in that second series, but GX, probably one of those teams that is looking like they're going to go out without a win. For G2, you hope that you can keep this up. BDS went undefeated. They're probably going to want to try and match that here, and it's going to be interesting to see. But Yike and Caps are truly fantastic. If everybody else starts stepping up to the level they have been playing at already in this split, it's basically GG for everybody else in the league, in my opinion. And then moving on to our other first round series from this side of the bracket, the number 4 versus number 5 seed. Theoretically, the closest matchup. Did it live up to the hype? Kind of, I guess. It was the 4th seed in Mad Lions Koi taking on the 5th seed in Fnatic. And Fnatic predictably is going to be able to take them down. As much as Mad has looked very good in the regular season, Fnatic is the better team. I think we all kind of saw this coming. I was more excited for SK versus Vitality in terms of closeness, but honestly, Game 2 was probably the closest game that we got in the entirety of the first round. Worth noting, every single series in the first round was a 2-0. Very funny that that ended up happening like that, but Fnatic is going to be able to take this as well. They're going to move on to a date with G2 in the series that we're going to cover in just a second, but Mad moves down. I still don't think this means that they are out by any means, but this was certainly a more expected outcome this side of the bracket. I think a lot of people saw G2, people saw Fnatic, and they were like, those are probably the 2 teams that are going to make top 4 from this side, from this group, and so far, so good for Fnatic. Player of the series is going to go to Noah in the bot lane. Finally, Noah had a good series this year. It feels like it has just been such a dry spell for Noah. For a lot of AD carries at this level, basically nobody has been able to step up and be super consistent. Ironically enough, Supa on the other side has probably been the most consistent. I gave him my All-Pro nod, if only because he had a couple of really good games, and he really wasn't bad in a lot of them, although he was outplayed in this series by Noah. It is really good to see him kind of get back into form that we saw in summer. He was really starting to figure something out. Obviously, his mental really got shaken when he started underperforming in some big moments because the LEC fandom is very loud, and you could tell that affected him. He's on social media a lot. You can tell that, and obviously, I think the expectation and the weight of everything really started to get into his head. Maybe that carried over into the beginning of this year, but this was a really nice series, I think, to get himself back on track. June still concerns me. I think a lot of the plays that he made didn't really need to be made this game. Noah was doing a lot of the good work himself, but June was a lot better on the Renata in game 2, and, really was important with those ultimates down the stretch. Humanoid definitely won in the mid lane. He has been amazing so far in 2024. I think there is a strong case to be made, and I know I say this in every video, that 2024 so far, far, very small sample size, has been the best start to a year that Humanoid has ever had. He's on pace to have the best year of his career right now, and I think that is pretty massive. Razork's playing well. Oscar tried his best to do nothing on the Yone in game number 2. Really not the ideal circumstance, but Razork, Humanoid, and Noah were all really good in this series, and I think really helped push Fnatic forward, specifically Noah. If this bot lane is going to step up and genuinely be relevant, be a top 3, top 4 bot lane, which is super wide open, by the way, right now. There are really only a couple bot lanes that are even playing competent at the current moment, and so, you know, if Noah and June can get on a hot streak and just start playing well, this is a top 2, top 3 team in the LEC, because of how Razork and Humanoid have been able to play, but for Matt on the other side, not an awful performance for your first ever best of 3, best of series really at all for a lot of these players at the top level. Fresco is going to get my dud of the series. The Ezreal in game 2 was really bad. Every single Ezreal ult missed except for the last one, which didn't matter really at all. But even so, like, Ezreal feels like such a bait pick in the current meta. You know, I understand that it's supposed to be there to try and poke. Like, you're this massive poke artillery ADC in the mid lane, and it pairs up really well with AP junglers like the Brand, and you can do a lot with it. But at the end of the day, it really doesn't get a lot of push, and it's really hard to actually generate pressure through the middle of the map with the Ezreal, and I think we've seen that the multiple times it's been played. Elioya tried his best to keep this series relevant, but nobody else really stepped up. Alvaro had some moments on the Rakan that were really good, but Fresco and Supa, I think, were 2 of the more underwhelming players in this series, and Supa was somebody that this team was really kind of playing through, I would say, so far in the winter split. I wouldn't expect this to become a big turnoff. Alvaro still looked really good, and Noah had a very good series, but it is worth noting that in Supa's first LEC best of 3, it really did not work out. It was not an entirely good showing, and for Mab, you know, there is some questions about whether or not they're going to be able to overcome some of the inexperience that they've shown. 4th seed is really good in the regular season. Going above 500 is really good, but a lot of people are claiming that that is because of the synergy that they already had, that a bunch of these players had already played together last year, and a lot of these rosters have kind of had a lot of turnover in the LEC because of the salary cap this year. And so, you know, it's going to be interesting to see if they can pick up a win against GX in the bottom part of the bracket. You would hope that they would be able to do that. You would hope that they would be the better team of those 2, but it's certainly going to be interesting. Either way, Fnatic looking really good, and, you know, it inspires me that it's probably going to be Fnatic and G2 getting out of this group, basically no matter who wins this second series. Obviously, Mad can do a lot of growth and development, but with Noah playing super well here, Razork and Humanoid have already been on fire across this split already. Fnatic is in a really good spot, so, you know, no matter what happens in that next series, they look phenomenal. Honestly, this series gives you confidence that they could potentially go up against a G2 team that has been a little bit inconsistent and potentially, you know, actually take some wins off of them. Remember, you only need to win 2 of 3 in order to progress into the top 4. It's certainly not out of reach for Fnatic, but are they going to be able to do it? Well, I guess we can find out right now. And finally, that's going to bring us to our final series here of the video, our finals of Group A, or the top side of the bracket, as I'm calling it, between G2 and Fnatic, the 2 teams we just talked about winning, and it was G2 who was going to take it, but we got our first 2-1. We get our first 3-game set in this best of 3, so good stuff to Fnatic for being the first losing team to actually be able to take a game against the team that beats them. But G2, the second team to officially qualify for the best of 4 stage, they will take on BDS in winners finals. The winner of that will obviously move on to the grand finals, to LEC finals. But let's talk about this series before we get all grand in terms of, you know, what we're expecting for the rest of the LEC season. G2 looked really good here. Even in game 2, I thought they did a lot of interesting things. All of these games were interesting, and Fnatic actually did put up a good fight. Unfortunately, game 3 was just G2 being a little bit more proactive. We'll talk about it in a second, but player of the series absolutely has to go to Broken Blade in the top lane. I've been very critical of Broken Blade over the course of this split. I've talked about how Yike and Caps have been so integral and so important towards what G2 are doing, and nobody else feels like they're really, you know, pushing this team forward nearly as much. Well, in this series, it was Broken Blade and it was Mickey X that were doing a ton for G2 to be able to enable this team to win a lot of fights. Now, Caps was certainly the damage, although Hans was also very much the damage in this game, but the Zac was major in game 3, and the Braum was major in game 3, and I think those are the 2 biggest reasons why G2 actually was able to win this game in the first place. So credit to Broken Blade. Apparently he's been spamming Zac in solo queue, as I've heard, and, you know, obviously we've seen this pick in the LCK, we've seen it in a couple of other regions as well, a couple of the minor regions. We know that Zac top is something that is playable. We've even seen this team play Zac mid in the past. It's not really a huge surprise to see it, but it really worked in both games 1, but in both game 1 and game 3, but I would say especially in game number 3, where it really really started to take over in the back half of the game, consistently jumping in, creating panic. They have a lot of backliners on Fnatic, you know, Karma, Azir, Varus. Like, these are champions that really don't want to be jumped on by a Zac and really don't have a lot of tools to get out of that, specifically the Varus. And Zac really made his life hell in this game. Noah really didn't get a chance to play in the final game of this series. So credit to Broken Blade. This pick is very much working basically every time they pull it out. It might even draw a ban from teams as we go further along into the playoffs. But the Braum continues to be massive for Mickey. He was the MVP last year over the course of the entirety of the LEC year, and a lot of that was because of his Braum play. Like, it was his best champion last year, and he really was able to do things and create pressure on that champion in the mid game that others just weren't able to do. It wasn't necessarily the pressure that won them this game, but just the standard Braum stuff of being able to protect the carries, making sure that Kalista was always in a good spot. Braum was crucial in this series to make sure that G2 actually was going to be able to win. Without Mickey playing so well, I actually do think that, you know, Game 3 becomes a lot harder in the teamfight stage. So credit to BB, credit to Mickey. They were the standouts here, and they were the two that I really, really wanted to see, specifically Broken Blade, get back on track in a series like this. But Yiken Caps, nice to take a background role. Yike in particular maybe had one of his worst series of the year. Not that he was awful, just that he didn't always constantly have pressure like he does in basically every other game that this team has played over the course of this year. So I would say good stuff overall for G2, but again, they're done now in the group stage. They're moving on to the top 4. They are moving on to BDS, and, you know, we'll talk about that series at the end of the video. But for Fnatic, you know, it's nice to be able to pick up a win in Game 2. I do think they played relatively well in that game. Noah continued to look good, and Razork, I thought, looked particularly good in this series, but dud of the series for me is going to go to Oscarinin on the top side. That Karma in Game 3 was just miserable. It just did not work. I get it that, like, I understand how in theory that is like a counter to Zac, but I don't actually think that ended up working out for them. June also was significantly worse in this series than he was previously. Humanoid was not nearly as good as Caps. There were just a couple of moments where Fnatic felt a little bit overmatched, and I think a lot of that just has to do with G2 being really good, but, you know, some of the flaws in Fnatic are exposable, I think. Oscar has really not been all that good this year, and I think people were really looking for that year 2 jump because he was really good down the stretch in summer, or I would say pretty good down the stretch in summer, certainly a top half and above average top laner in the league last year down the stretch, but top lane's a really hard position to break through in, really deep at the LEC level, and honestly, Oscar has not looked particularly good. You take away the Cassante, and Oscar doesn't really have any good games on any other champions over the course of this split, so definitely something to monitor. I don't think he was miserable, but he certainly was a negative for Fnatic overall. I almost gave this to June. I almost gave this to Humanoid as well in the mid lane in terms of dud of the series, but I think realistically, Oscar was probably the most notable. Again, Razork continues to be very consistent, but, you know, G2 just has better macro than Fnatic, and clearly there was just better team fighting tools down the stretch for G2 in the back half of the series. It happens. You're not going to freak out about it too much, but for Fnatic, you're now down in losers finals, if you will. You still have a chance to get out and get into the top 4. You weren't really expected to win this series anyways, and like I said, you're definitely going to be favorites no matter who beats who in that other, you know, losers game between GIANTX and between Mad Lions. We've already seen what they can do against Mad, and Mad's probably the better of those two teams, and so you would feel pretty good about Fnatic being able to get out of this group, but nothing is set in stone. They probably would have liked to win this to guarantee their spot and also put them in the upper bracket of the best of 5 stage. But again, congratulations to G2. They have that date with Destiny with BDS. It felt pretty inevitable that those two teams would be coming out as the first seeds from both sides of the bracket, and that's exactly what we got. If they're going to be able to keep up their pace here, especially if BB and Mickey are back, and if Hans is playing well like he has recently, this is the best team in the LEC, like I said earlier. This really reinforced that in my mind. Yeah, are there things they can clean up? Absolutely, but in terms of their grand gameplay, I think G2 honestly looks as good now as they have at any point in the year. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC Playoffs Round 1 overview and analysis video. Was very excited to do this. Of course, we covered the 6 series that we got in the first section here, the first weekend of playoffs, or the group stage, or whatever you want to call it. You can see up on your screen how those have, you know, moved around. I still have the group stage, like, format and bracket here because, well, it's the same format. It really is groups, and I just separated it A and B from top side and bottom side of the bracket. G2 and BDS being the teams that move out, they will play each other next weekend. That's one of the frustrating things is typically once we get into the best of 5 stage, I would like to cover these series game by game throughout the week so that we get really in-depth coverage of the games that really matter. But because of where G2 and BDS are, I'm not going to be able to cover that one game by game. Next week will also be a series overview kind of coverage. Don't worry, once we get into the weekend after that, where it's only 2 or so series a week, or, you know, we can start covering stuff on the weekend, then I'm actually going to start going, you know, game by game in these series. But G2 and BDS will be playing next weekend. We also get both of the bottom sides of these brackets. So let's go ahead and go over what I expect to happen, starting with GX versus Mad Lions Koi. Like I said earlier, I would expect Mad to be the better of these two teams. GX is just not particularly good. There's a lot of flaws in their game, and I don't think they're going to be able to go up against a team like Mad that has a very clear idea of how they want to play. If Supa and Alvaro can play well, and if Aoyoya wins his jungle matchup into Peach, I don't really see a lot of ways for GX to win, and so I'm picking Mad there, but Fnatic should be the team to get out of this group. They already beat Mad once, and they are the better team. They should be able to beat them again. Fnatic should be the second team, I should say, to come out of Group A. And then in Group B, you've got Heretics taking on SK. This is a much more interesting conversation, in my opinion. This could go either way. I'm pretty split on these two teams. I think a lot of people are going to pick SK, but I'm going to pick Heretics here. I do think they should be better. Perks does relatively well into Niski. He always has historically, and so I would expect him to actually be fine. And, Yankos into Isma, taking advantage of a young jungle, or a young rookie jungler, and then, Exakik and DOS aren't exactly in the best form. I think Heretics would be able to get past that, and then Vitality and Heretics, that is an interesting matchup. I mean, you have Kaiser and Perks last year who were on Heretics, of course, VTO who was on Heretics, and the others were on Vitality. It's going to be interesting. You would hope that Heretics could win that, but honestly, Vitality are probably favorites. I think that one's also very interesting. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if any of these three teams were able to get out of the group, but let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Would love to know who you think the other two teams to get out of the group stage are. What do you think is going to happen between G2 and BDS? I have G2 in that series for what it's worth. I would just love to hear you guys' thoughts down below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't cover only the LEC on this channel. We cover all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL every single week on this channel. So hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.